Hello? Hello? Can everyone hear us? Wicked. Okay. Now we do the bit of making sure we're not knocking into something that's going to move. Hello. Hi. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out on a very cold Monday night. It is such a joy and a privilege to be here tonight to celebrate the launch of How to Read Minds with Aimee Cliff. My name is Mary. I'm a lighthouse with a team of incredible humans, and I wanted to thank you for being out tonight. I wanted to thank those of you who could for wearing masks. It makes such a difference collectively, especially given we have a few members of the community who are immune compromised or going through chemo, and also it means that those who can't don't have to wear them, so it is much appreciated as ever. I'm going to give a wee introduction to Aimee, just to give you a run of the evening. I'm going to do a wee intro, we're going to have a wee reading, there's going to be some questions from me, and there can be some questions from you, including the lovely audience online. And then we're going to have a signing in the other room. We are a room full of various neurodivergences. If you need to get up or move around, or a noise is annoying you, or one of the chairs is squeaking and we need to change something, then this is exactly the kind of space where you can say that. It's going to work two ways. So here, without further ado, is Aimee's biography. Although if anyone has read Fergus's wonderful Weird Pride blog for ahead of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, it's on our website and it's wicked. So Aimee Cliff is a psychotherapist. She specializes in neurodiversity affirming and LGBTQ inclusive talking therapy. Previously, she was a music and culture journalist writing for The Guardian, Independent, Days, Pitchfork, and Huck. She was one of the inaugural winners of the Welcome Collection and Spread the World Writing Awards, and How to Read Minds, the Science and Art of Empathy is her first book. Will you put your hands together to welcome Aimee? Can I get you started with a little reading? There we go. I've put that there in case you want to put your microphone in a stand in order to do that.
So I'm just going to read a little from the introduction, from the beginning of the book. Okay. What do we mean exactly when we say that someone lacks empathy? In the past, I never gave it much thought when I used the phrase casually, as most of us do, to describe someone whose lack of consideration for others was beyond the pale, like, say, Nigel Farage or a best friend's ex-boyfriend. It was a catch-all shorthand for people who were unkind, rude, or callous. The person who lacked empathy was always the other, until I was diagnosed as autistic in my late 20s, and suddenly it was me. The diagnostic criteria for autism includes difficulties in social communication and interaction. In the past, some experts have asserted that autistic people have these difficulties because they lack the ability to feel or express empathy. Though this hypothesis has been robustly challenged and even outright rejected by some, it still shapes our cultural conception of autism. Today, the NHS describes autistic people as finding it, quote, hard to understand how other people think or feel. Renowned autism researcher Dr. Uta Frith has argued that while, quote, most of us are born to read minds, autistic people are missing a gadget in our brains, which she describes as being like a sat-nav for emotional intelligence. Even the word autism is taken from the Greek prefix aut, meaning self. From its inception, our condition has been characterized as selfism, a total fixation with an inability to see beyond ourselves. Incidentally, around the same time that I got my diagnosis, I was at the beginning of the long process of training to become a psychotherapist. I was a volunteer counsellor at a crisis helpline where I offered support and reassurance to people struggling with everything from abuse to disordered eating to suicidal thoughts. I had completed my first year of counselling training and was in the process of applying for a master's degree that would lead to my qualification. The contradiction was not lost on me. My spare time was dedicated to the practice and study of empathy, a factor I struggled to reconcile with the diagnosis of a disorder that supposedly made me incapable of it. The self-doubt that already lurked in the shadows of my mind A common feeling among trainee therapists intensified. Was I pursuing a profession rooted in empathy to overcompensate for something that I naturally lacked? Empathy, we're told, is what makes us human. In his 2014 bestseller, Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It, the popular philosopher Roman Krznaric argues that without the sacred trait of empathy, mothers would ignore the hunger cries of newborn babies. Charities fighting child poverty would fold due to lack of donations. Few people would make the effort to help a person in a wheelchair trying to open a shop door, and your friends would yawn with boredom as you told them about your marriage breaking up. In fact, he writes, the capacity to empathize is one of the greatest hidden talents possessed by almost every human being. Among those who don't have this hidden talent, Krznaric notes, are psychopaths and people on the autism spectrum. Together, they account for no more than around 2% of the general population. This is his words. The other 98%, of humanity is born to empathize and wired for social connection. As of July 2020, there were around 7.8 billion people on the planet. This means that there were roughly 156 million autistic people or psychopathic people meeting the criteria for a clinical diagnosis if we follow the logic of Krznaric's 2% estimation. The actual prevalence of autism globally is unknown, with some studies suggesting that as many as 1 in 4 autistic children are undiagnosed, so the real figure may be significantly higher. Krznaric waves away this 2% as an aside. He casts out those who supposedly lack empathy, as I used to do myself, and implies that they're bad people, people who do not donate to charity, hold doors open for others, or feed their children. It is hopefully unnecessary to point out that these generalizations don't hold true about hundreds of millions of autistic people, but perhaps even more concerning to me is the simplistic fairy tale that empathy is something that some of us are wired for and others are not. This depiction of empathy does us all a disservice. I imagine that if you're not autistic or otherwise neurodivergent, it could feel soothing to hear that without having to self-reflect, work hard, or cultivate any skills, you're already predisposed to be empathetic. You were born to read minds, in Fritz's words. Meanwhile, those accused of lacking the correct wiring or gadgets are left with the impression that they are something less than human, and this is in itself a barrier to empathy. It stops us from getting curious about other people's experiences and building relationships with them. There is a much kinder and more hopeful option. Empathy is not a passive personality trait that you are either born with or not, something you either possess or lack. It is something that all of us can access if we choose to. By expanding the definition of empathy to include everyone and all our myriad, brilliant, strange expressions of it, we can only deepen our ability to empathize and connect with one another.
Thank you. I guess my starting place would be just to make sure we are all on the same page by asking what empathy is, both in the cultural imagination of those of us in the room, and then what is this radical disruptive empathy that you are suggesting?
Yeah, so the question of what empathy is probably the question that I spent a year banging my head against the wall about at the start of trying to write this book. Because, you know, as I kind of alluded to just there, I went into this subject from the perspective of someone who had just been diagnosed and was trying to make sense of what it all meant for me, what these, you know, stereotypes all meant, where they all came from, how they impacted people like me. And yeah, I wanted to set out to write a book that challenged these old narratives. And so I felt that the natural starting point was to define what empathy is. And I realized that when we talk about empathy, it's we're talking about so many different things at once. It's such a diffuse subject. Generally, people, if you ask, you know, if you ask people generally to define it, they might talk about it being not the same as sympathy. So sympathy being like pity, and empathy being more about trying to take the perspective of somebody else or feel how they're feeling. They might talk about Brené Brown. They might talk about, you know, from a psychological perspective, we might talk about cognitive empathy, which is thinking about what other people are thinking, or affective empathy, which is feeling what other people are feeling, or we might talk about emotional contagion, which is sort of catching the feelings of other people, crying if you see someone else crying. Trying to actually bring all of these things together and work out what we're talking about when we talk about empathy was kind of my starting point at trying to boil this down. As I also talk about here, I think that despite it having all of these different facets, most generally and most commonly, I would say that we use empathy as a kind of shorthand for really it's the same thing as compassion or kindness or caring about other people. So when there's this narrative that some people lack it, it just depicts those people as very uncaring or unable to build connection. So I set out trying to really work out what I was talking about when I was talking about empathy. And I was quite inspired, very inspired by Bell Hooks' writing about love. And in the same way, I think empathy is probably, there's an aspect of it that is just quite ineffable and personal and hard to define exactly. But what I did come up with were these sort of 5 pillars or 5 key arguments that I think make up the practice of empathy. But the core of my argument or the definition, I suppose, that I'm laying out is that I don't see empathy as a personality trait that you have, so much as I see it as a relational process like love. It's a process of connection, building connection with another person. So it's not something that I believe anyone can be deficient in.
I love that definition, and so much of what you were writing about challenged ideas that I had about care and empathy, and about having been one of those people who had been told was very empathetic and then had to go back and question why had people said that and what had that disempowered me from doing in terms of curiosity about other people and making that effort. Before we get into the 5 pillars, because then we can really dig into this definition, I wanted to situate what went into the book in terms of research a little bit. So I've got my questions split across it. One sec. My fold was across the question. Before my research question, I wanted to ask about why we should. Why should we practice empathy first?
Why should we practice empathy? I guess so. I'm a psychotherapist, as I've mentioned, and so it's really, it's part of the work that I do, and part of my philosophy, I guess, is that I really believe that relationships are healing, and that we need relationships and we need connection. All of us do. I think empathy is the way to really build that together. So that's why I think it's something that we should all think about. Freud said a lot of weird stuff, but one of the things that I think that he said that was pretty good was that psychoanalysis is a cure through love, roughly his words. I think that connection in itself is really healing and really important for all of us, however we come at that and whatever that means for us individually.
Yeah, I loved it as a tool in that toolkit of building a better world. You made a very compelling case for it. So my question in terms of the research was, you even have a quote in that introduction. The research around empathy and around autism is so full of now contested, often debunked science. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you navigate the contested ground or theories that have stuck within the field of psychology or popular imagination, despite being deeply flawed, and how did that shape the research that you did put into the book?
Yeah, so really engaging with those theories was a big part of the process. I mean, it was a big part of my original motivation for writing this book was that I was aware of things like the theory of mind model of autism, which suggests that autistic people don't have what's called theory of mind, or the extreme male brain theory of autism, which suggests that autistic people have what's called extreme male brains, which means that our brains are wired to systemize and not to empathize, in the words of the researcher. And I was aware of these theories, and I was aware also that they were controversial and there had been backlash or people who had decried them in the past. But I couldn't find, when I was diagnosed and I wanted to really dig into this, I couldn't really find a book that really laid out the history of these theories, how they've given rise to these stereotypes that autistic people lack empathy, how they've been challenged. So what I wanted to do was draw together that research, also draw together the research that challenges those theories, and the academics and people who are much more qualified than me in fields such as psychology and neuroscience, who have already kind of dug into the nuts and bolts of how these theories don't really hang together. But what was also really important to me was embedding all of that within really looking at neurodivergent people's lived experiences as well, and bringing those voices in and bringing in new alternative theories about empathy and neurodivergence and what it means to be human from the point of view of people who are actually neurodivergent, and leading much more exciting scholarship like the double empathy problem and all of those newer theories. So putting all of that in conversation with each other.
It worked. And I think it wears its research lightly. And I was mentioning to you when we were chatting, one of the things that's really refreshing in this book is that the research is presented, and often data is presented in a really transparent way, where you do get to see, oh, that's a study of 18 people that happened 20 years ago, and they built that, something around that. And so you can take it with a pinch of salt, or you can run with when it was done and maybe what the person doing the study might have held as opinions. Now, if we can get into your 5 pillars, will you tell us what the 5 pillars of empathy are to you, and then we can dig into each of them.
Yeah, so the book is kind of split into these 5 chapters, 5 pillars that explore empathy and how to practice it, I suppose, from different angles. The first being that empathy is humble. The idea of this being that it goes into, I talk in this chapter about theory of mind, which I just mentioned, and this idea that empathy is being able to kind of anticipate or guess what's kind of going on in the mind of someone else, or mind read, as some of the researchers put it. But essentially, my argument is that we can't read minds. Shockingly, it's a spoiler for the book. But we, certainly something that I have taken from my therapy training and in the work that I do is that it's always about checking understanding with another person, not making assumptions, and really being curious and being open-minded and working to understand each other from that perspective. The second pillar talks about how empathy is embodied. So as much as it is that kind of conscious cognitive process, it's also an embodied process. It's an energetic process. One of the examples that one of my interviewees used that I think about often is when you walk into a room where 2 people have just had a fight, you can feel that in the air. And that's that energetic sort of bodily sense is also part of empathy, and it's something that might get disrupted or be harder for us at different times or in different ways for all kinds of reasons. The third pillar is talking about empathy as amoral. So this is about detaching empathy from this idea of, the example I was giving in the introduction, as Krasnarek frames it, about being willing to hold doors open for other people and feed your children. I would see it less as this kind of morally virtuous personality trait, and more as a kind of a process that we choose to enter into or not, and that some people might have less capacity for at different times, but it doesn't make them a bad person. The fourth pillar is that empathy is radical, by which I mean that it's a process of relating and connecting between people. So, like anything between people, it's rooted in society and politics and identity and all of the systems around us, and all of those things will mediate and impact how we empathize with each other, and will create power imbalances between us. And I think that a necessary part of empathy is learning to try to recognize and redress those power imbalances in how we interact with each other. And then the fifth pillar is just that empathy is work, which kind of underpins, if a pillar can do this, it kind of underpins all the other pillars. Architecturally unsound, but it's just about the fact that this is an effortful process, and I think that that's actually I guess that's really the whole argument, is that I think that almost the effort that we put in to understand each other almost is the empathy, and is what's really meaningful.
Yeah, that there isn't. Yeah, I enjoyed that as an invitation to practice, and I think through the book there's also a real invitation to get it wrong, and this assumption that it's not necessarily one particular group of people that's going to get it more wrong than anyone else, but that it might look different, and that we expect it to look a particular kind of wrong when somebody doesn't do it right, and they have sort of discernible autistic traits versus, or a man empathizing or a woman empathizing. Or if I was going to drill down into some of those, on the humble one, can you tell us a little bit more about communication? And that's where you write a bit about the double empathy. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and how things get lost in translation, or how we end up speaking to each other in completely different languages, and how we work our way through that?
Yeah, so the double empathy problem is at this point quite a famous theory in the world of autism. But for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's the theory that the breakdowns in empathy or in communication that have historically been pinned on autistic people lacking empathy are actually a result of communication differences, or communication sort of getting confused, or wires getting crossed in interactions between people of different neurotypes. So essentially, it's a two-way issue of communication rather than one person having a deficit. And this has been borne out in a lot of studies over the last 10 or so years, where they've sort of taken groups of autistic people, groups of non-autistic people, and then mix them together. And consistently what's been found is that information transfer, so doing a sort of game of telephone where people whisper things around the group, is less effective in the mixed groups, and more effective in the groups where people have the same kind of neurotype and communication style. And also rapport building. There's been a few studies that have shown that neurotypical people or non-autistic people might be more likely to take a dislike to autistic people, or read our traits or way of communicating in a sort of negative light. So yeah, all of which is to say, I think these studies and this theory makes really clear how our kind of perceptions of each other are maybe shaped by social norms and biases that we carry into communication with each other, can shape how we react to each other, and also just the way that we communicate can, to give one example, autistic people, we can be very literal and what some might call blunt in the way that we will put information across. And to some people, that might be received badly. And the autistic side, you're thinking, I literally was just trying to share information with you, so I don't understand what's gone wrong in that interaction. So having an awareness of these differences and how these differences shape our communication, and just having, as we were saying, that open-mindedness and trying not to make assumptions about intention behind things without sort of checking understanding is a really important part of empathizing.
And you really connect that to other sort of gaps where things can get lost in translation, whether that's language or culture, or in so many ways that we make an assumption always from a sense of our own understanding of how we would behave. And then somebody behaves differently, and it's like, well, it must mean X, Y, Z. And the not making assumptions rang in a very different way to the sort of way it's generally quite glibly said. I don't know if anyone else had a mom who's like, don't make assumptions. Assumptions make an ass out of you and me. But we do, and to a certain degree, we have to, in order to navigate a world where we're bombarded with information. And if I were to skip into a different pillar on that one, you talk a little bit about how essentially shortcuts to empathy and how that happens, for instance, between autistic people or between different in groups, where you recognize something in someone that gives you a. Can you talk about how that works and how we navigate that?
Yeah, so I guess also jumping off from the double empathy problem, we can have shortcuts with people who are, in that example, they might have the same neurotype as us, but it also might be that they are of the same culture that we are, the same class background, or, all kinds of different social identities or things we could have in common that might make us feel more easily connected to someone. Perhaps we are slightly more able to assume certain things about their experience or how they feel because we have that proximity. But then in other ways, we won't have that proximity, and they are also always still unknowable to us. But I talk a bit in the book about, and Damien Milton, who came up with the theory, has spoken about this himself as well. But the need for the double empathy problem to be expanded in a more intersectional way as well, to recognize that I might have with other autistic people a shortcut in one sense of trying to understand each other, but I also I work with a lot of autistic clients these days, and I'm in community with a lot of various neurodivergent people, and we might have one thing in common and a million things not in common. So it's also trying to always keep that openness for the differences in our experiences, as well as the recognizing where we might have more connection at the same time. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it does.
On the this is sort of jumping slightly backwards on the amoral, empathy is amoral, which I think is quite a challenging take, because I think a lot of, especially in left-wing spaces, in progressive spaces, the desire to be a good person and be perceived to be a good person is something that we're very invested in. And the idea of empathy being amoral, and that it's not a value judgment, that it's a practice, is quite challenging to a lot of that way of perceiving ourselves. But I feel like it's also very important, especially in a time after, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, where people are suddenly realizing, oh, I don't get to just say, one thing and do another. And people suddenly are more offended about being called a racist than having done something racist. And that sort of gap there. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, within that, that idea of being sort of imperfect, and that idea of within amorality, and the idea of good people, but also the idea of evil people, and the way as a society we construct an idea of who the bad people are and how those two things interact.
So there's a few things in here. No, it's really so. I mean, so first of all, the thing to say that I want to say is that it was important to me to have this chapter, this pillar talking about empathy being amoral, because I didn't want this argument to just be autistic people and neurodivergent people and all of us can experience empathy, therefore we're good. It's kind of buying into the binary that's being set up already, and I think actually there are a lot of autistic people, neurodivergent people, and just people for many different reasons who might struggle with empathy or aspects of empathy at times or all the time. Even myself, I'm at work as a therapist. I turn up regulated and calm and attuned, and I practice empathy, but I might go home and not practice empathy with my partner that day. I'm feeling, not perfect all the time. And none of us are. You can be dysregulated or beyond your capacity and not be able to perfectly empathize all the time. And a lot of autistic people do report having difficulties with, sometimes with the perspective taking, or sometimes with the more embodied aspects of empathy. And what I really wanted to get across is that, no matter what your approach to empathy or what your capacity for it is, that doesn't make you a bad person. But I still think it's a good thing for us all to practice and try to do. So again, I come back to the love comparison. I think it's something that we all have access to and can practice in the way that makes sense to and feels accessible to us. And yeah, not having it or not being able to do it in that moment doesn't necessarily make you bad. And you touched on the thing about evil people and what we do with bad people as well. And this is an argument that comes in the sense that I talk in the book about how we often use lacking empathy as a shorthand for people who are bad, and it's very trendy at the moment to talk about narcissists in particular, or use various labels of people who we've decided are the people that lack empathy and therefore are the bad ones. And I think my instinct as a therapist and as a person is always to try to resist, as I said, binaries that really divide people very neatly into good and bad, and to resist pathologizing labels that suggest we can sort of easily identify who the bad people or the monsters, bogeymen are. Yeah.
If I can jump to a question I had a bit later, on that point about sort of the seepage of clinical terms or therapeutic terms into the public imagination. Were you at all worried about anything in your book being sort of extrapolated into something it wasn't? Or conversely, are you hoping that some of it might seep into the popular imagination?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't mind it seeping. Some seepage would be. Yeah, I don't know. I think I do criticize in the book as I was saying, the spread of kind of pathologizing labels, or what we might call kind of therapy speak, but specifically therapy speak that's maybe used to create these sort of categories of people, or armchair diagnosed people. I'm not really about diagnosing or pathologizing in that way in my work, and I'm definitely not worried about sharing and disseminating therapeutic insights generally. I don't think we should gatekeep that stuff. I also don't think, I think that therapy is all about relationships and like I said, healing through relationships and love. So I don't know that reading a book or getting insights from anything you read or social media is necessarily a replacement for that, but it's just more tools and information you can gain. Yeah.
Has writing the book shaped your own therapy practice?
I think it's kind of solidified for me. I'm an integrative therapist, and see myself as relational, which means basically fancy words, meaning that I blend different approaches of therapy, and I really prioritize the relationship that I have with each person. And I think for me, especially in the research that I did for this book, I interviewed quite a lot of other neurodivergent people for it, and spoke to a lot of people about how they give and receive empathy and how they feel about it and their experiences, and it really solidified for me that approach that I have, that or that I tried to have in my practice, which is, I think everyone is different and needs different things and needs other people to show up in a slightly different way. So I try to practice what I preach in terms of having that openness and that kind of flexibility and malleability with different people.
Speaking of practicing what you preach, this is not a preachy book, but it is a political book, and it's a book where your politics of care are sort of show up over and over again in a way that seems really obvious as you get to know you, the person, through the book and the things you care about and the way you show up for people, but also is sort of at odds with a genre of self-help or a way of writing that sort of strips back anything that might be viewed as not neutral, or anything that might concern someone who's like, oh well, I want to read a book about brains. I don't want to read a book about the genocide in Gaza. I want to read a book about brains. I don't want to read a book about. How did you navigate putting those personal politics and the way you look at everything from capitalism and class and the wider politics into a book? And yeah, who was the reader then for that book?
Yeah, I think this was always, for me, this was always going to be a political book, because I think that's me, and that's who I am and how I see things in terms of, I think therapy is political and everything is political. And this was a book very, the beginnings of this for me were very rooted in me being diagnosed and becoming really influenced by the disability justice movement and the neurodiversity movement spanning back to the 90s. And yeah, so I really wanted it to be in that lineage. But I will say also, yeah, as we went through the process, and I went through the process of writing it, I did think a lot about who is that reader, and partly that ideal reader was the person like me who had just been diagnosed and was trying to make sense of their sense of themselves, and pull that apart from these ableist stereotypes that we've been told. But I also felt that I wanted the person who might be in the airport looking for a book to read about brains to pick this up. I wanted the person who might teach autistic people, or have a niece or a nephew who's autistic, or be sort of well-intentioned but not maybe know very much about the neurodiversity movement and the political all of the politics that I wanted to bring in. So I made some quite deliberate choices in terms of, I wanted the book, in the way that it was written, to feel very warm and accessible and easy to read. That's really what I hope I've managed to achieve with it. And in terms of the way that it was titled and packaged, I was really inspired by some of my favorite nonfiction books of recent years, like What White People Can Do Next, or The Transgender Issue, which I feel like have titles that maybe are a bit cheeky and kind of belie the, once you open it up, it's bam, race is a social construct, gender is a social construct, and I wanted, I wanted perhaps a similar experience here of, you are hopefully going to read a lot about, to learn a lot about empathy from this book, which is not, which the cover makes clear, but I hope that, as you say, readers might, as they get into it, encounter some more radical, more expansive ideas than they had initially realized they were going to, and hopefully that could, I don't know, influence or change some people's minds. That would be the goal.
I think that's a beautiful idea, and I think especially in a radical bookshop, sometimes it feels like radical literature doesn't get read, picked up, absorbed by exactly the people who would most benefit from the ideas within them. And this is a book that I think has, intersectional, feminist, queer, disabled narratives that wherever you sit on any of, you're going to encounter new ideas and the layers in the book so cleverly bring you along into it that even if you start not thinking you would agree with them, this sort of paradigm that you create for empathy challenges you as a reader to be like, okay, well, I've got to go on that journey. If X, then Y. I'm going to quickly just check time because I have like a million questions, but I'm sure you do too. So I'm going to ask one more and then I'm going to bounce it out to you. And if anyone is watching online and you have a question, then feel free to shoot it out. I was like, which is the one that I haven't asked you on my many different questions? If I could end by talking about this idea of empathy is the effort. And you write about, there's another line in the book where empathy is disruptive. It's in an act and it's in an interaction. It's not a one-way thing. Can you talk a little bit about that when you mean the work for those of us who are not a therapist, literally doing it for work?
Yes, it is literally work for me. Yeah, I guess in that sense of empathy being an interaction, I think an important thing for me that I was considering in the book is that, we often talk about things like if someone starts crying when they see something sad on TV, it means they're empathetic. And I would question or challenge whether exactly that is empathy. It certainly means you're sensitive, caring, compassionate, having an emotional reaction. But if you went to therapy and your therapist you cried and your therapist just cried, you wouldn't really be getting anywhere with that. That wouldn't be helpful. So I think empathy is something that's more, it takes more of an interaction, it takes offering more, and really sort of walking over the bridge to try and meet the other person in the middle. So trying to come into their experience in a more proactive way. The therapist Carl Rogers wrote about empathy. He founded the sort of person-centered school of therapy, and he has a very famous description of empathy as being walking around in somebody else's inner world, as if you are them but not exactly as them. And I really love that kind of proactive imagery of empathy. That's really what it means to me, is that sense of sort of trying to dig in and explore and look around, not just sort of sitting and passively absorbing, if that makes sense.
Within that, if we're then trying to walk around in the world of other people, say Farage, but we're living in a political moment where some ways of thinking and approaching other human beings feel so unfathomable. And in this exchange, there is a vulnerability, and you talk about authenticity, and it requires both people to make that leap of letting someone into the world or stepping through the door into someone's world. How do we do empathy when it looks like that? Should we be doing empathy when it looks like that? With Nigel Farage. Or the reformer next door.
I mean, I don't know.
Maybe not the die-hard face of the machine, but maybe the reformer next door.
I guess, what I will say is that I think that really involved process of, as you say, really trying to enter each other's world and understand each other. As you say, it's two-way, and you can only go into someone else's world as much as they're willing to let you in. So sometimes that just might not be possible. And I think we can extend, I guess, one of the things that I really wanted to do with my argument is really trying to separate compassion and kindness and all of that from empathy. So it might be that we can offer compassion and kindness to other people around us who we don't agree with, but we aren't able to enter into that kind of empathy with them. I would also say actually that part of empathy, I think, is it's not always really soft and gentle sort of agreeing with someone. It can be about kindly and lovingly and compassionately challenging their views and where they're coming from, and trying to hold them accountable the things that you don't agree with as well. So something that I touch on in the book is that I don't think empathy is necessarily always as warm and fuzzy and gentle as it's made out to be either. I think it can be more challenging than that.
I think it also comes across as a process that's incredibly powerful in both what that understanding brings you if you are not just making assumptions about someone. But again, bringing in that two-way street, it sometimes feels necessary if you are from a vulnerable or misunderstood or often stigmatized community to pull up the drawbridge on people where you don't know if they are safe to be who you are with them. And yet that protective instinct, which feels entirely natural and obviously very necessary at times, will inevitably also be a hardening to someone else's ability to learn to empathize with us and our experiences. How do we navigate it that way? That thing of, if you only saw what my life was like, you might dial down whatever it might be, your transphobia, your ableism. How do we stay soft to being open to offering our worlds to people who might not necessarily be the safest people to let walk around in our worlds?
It's a good question. How do we remain open to people who might want to explore our worlds despite not feeling safe? I mean, I think building safety is a two-way relational process, and a lot of the work I do with clients, when people come to therapy, they feel vulnerable. They don't necessarily feel ready to just share everything. A lot of us all have the drawbridge up for various reasons, and so building that sense of safety is about just consistency and showing up and building that security together. So I think it's a co-created process, right, of reaching that stage of feeling like it's safe enough to open up, that the trust is there and has been established and the security is there. It's not, I guess, it's something that I keep coming back to in the book, because I just don't think that empathy is something you can just do to another person or can be done to you. It's something that almost is entered into collaboratively.
It makes me think of like the referendums in Ireland and the idea that you would go to your own aunt or grandmother and talk about your queerness and invite them in, but it wasn't about offering that to a complete stranger at a protest and being like, here is my soul, if only you could see the whole of me, and how that works in practice really comes across in the book. Over to you, my lovelies. Yes, brilliant. If you ask your question, and then I will probably give a very shortened version of it into the microphone so anyone watching online can hear, but you ask the question however you would like. Whatever is more comfortable for you, go for it.
Just two comments. One's about, I don't think with autism it's a lack of empathy, I think it's difference in motivation. So the autistic person is less aware of the sort of sway of the group. So when you've got a group situation, people are very aware of how the group is leaning and how it's feeling. But the autistic person is more concerned about how they themselves view the situation, their own orientation and opinion on the situation. So I'm not looking so much to the actual, I found the right word, the sort of consensus of the group. The other point I would say was, you said that you can't read minds. I'm not totally in agreement with that, because sometimes I feel intuitively that I know what someone's thinking on immediately. But other times, with a bit of reflection, I can figure it out. And there's ways of testing that as well. I mean, to give an obvious example, Prince Andrew, the back of that car, and the back of that 4x4, whatever it was, I think you kind of know what he was thinking. I mean, just by the context and by the facial expression, he's thinking I'm in serious trouble, more or less, So by the context and by the facial expression, body language, people think you can to some extent read minds, but you don't want to, obviously, you don't want to be, you're not infallible. People are not infallible in that aspect, but to a certain extent it's possible.
I wonder, because those were more comments than questions, if you might want to respond to the comment folding in some of the comment in your answer.
Yes, if there was, well, I'll just respond to the second comment if that's okay. There was a comment about how sometimes it feels as though we can read minds. You might see someone in a situation such as Prince Andrew in the back of the car, or perhaps someone that you know very well, or a situation where you know the context very well, and it may feel that intuitively you know what that person is thinking and feeling. And yeah, I guess what I would say to that is that I totally agree that there are situations where the contextual information or how well you know that person could really inform or influence how accurately you might be able to guess and intuit and feel what you think is happening for that person. I think my point is really more, and I guess this is a bit of an autistic pedantry, kind of very pedantic of me. It's that although it feels that way, and although you might in many cases be accurate, we can never 100% say with 100% certainty that we know what is happening for somebody else. And I guess I really believe that everybody is the expert and the kind of author of their own experience. And so privileging exploring other people's experiences and listening to them and believing what they say and how they express how they feel over the assumptions that we may make, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a question here.
A couple of points. One, I know autistic people I know autistic people at times can't see body language. Is that a problem with showing empathy? And the second point I'd like to make is there is a film of an autistic person using Disney films as his role model in relationships. So if people are autistic or can't empathise, do they have to have a look for a role model to help them to see what that is?
I really like those questions. Thank you. I think body language can be part of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways in which autistic people might excel at or be impaired in or struggle with various different aspects of empathy. Some people, body language or reading nonverbal cues or giving nonverbal cues, that might be difficult or an aspect that they struggle with. But others not. I think one of the big things that I really get at in this book is that we're such a heterogeneous, different group of people. You can't really make these generalizations about everyone. So I'm sure there are many people who do struggle with the body language aspect of it, but also quite a lot of autistic people might not struggle with that part of it. So it's really hard to make generalizations. Also, to the point about finding role models, I think, for a lot of people, fiction role models and stories can be a really, really important way of learning about relationships and empathy. I know for me, growing up as an autistic teenager, fiction was definitely huge in learning about other people. So I'm sure that is,
Were there other questions in the room? Yeah.
Goes beyond the sort of human obsession with ourselves and something you were saying earlier that you can exactly how you put it, but how I perceived it, that you get conflated with, oh, what's the right thing to do? So what's the thing I need to do to make this other person happy business? And what is central, so I'm curious what are your thoughts on more broadly and how we understand the land with animals, fiction,
It's a beautiful question there about empathy and the more than human, the beyond human, whether we can empathize with the land or people or fiction or beyond the immediately human.
Yeah, sorry, I think I've tangled up in your chair. also, I just want to speak to, I think, the first part of your question. You said something about what we can learn from neurodivergence about empathy, or how, how, yeah, empathy can be something beyond or challenging social rules. And yeah, I just wanted to repeat that and just say that that's a really beautiful way of putting it, the way that you put it. And I that's something that I really wanted to explore in the book. And I talk about how I think true empathy is not actually about kind of performing these social norms that we've been taught it is. So kind of speaking and reacting and offering empathy in a specific kind of socially acceptable way, but it's more about meeting someone where they're at with what they need. And yeah, for a lot of neurodivergent people that I spoke to in the research of this book, it was often about, for some people it was more about action. What are you doing? I don't need supportive words. I need you to, help me out with fixing this thing that I'm trying to fix, or something like that. It's more practical. Or it might be about just trying to not judge people for the way that they communicate, take them as they are, be able to communicate with them in their kind of register. So the kind of flexibility of empathy and what it can really be is something that I think we can learn from neurodivergence. And in terms of empathizing with the beyond human, I also love that question. I'm not immediately sure how to answer it. I've definitely stuck to the human in this book, and kind of really exploring what it means to think of empathy as a process of love and of relating and connecting between human beings. But I certainly believe that you can love and connect with things that are beyond human as well. So I don't see why not empathy. Maybe that's a second book to research and write.
Is there another question, Marie? Or perhaps one online? Yes, go for it.
Do you think there is do you think there is like a limit to empathy within the context of emotional capacity, and also just like, so there's a lot of things in my brain, but basically tying in like compassion fatigue, like working in the healthcare setting, you're sort of exposed to high caliber stuff over and over and over and over and over again, and you're like, throughout the years you just kind of in a danger of like losing your empathy, like.
So there's a question there about whether there are limits to empathy and drawing on compassion fatigue, and which you do write about in the book.
Yeah, I do mention compassion fatigue in the chapter about empathy being work, because like all kinds of work, there's a limit to how much we can do of it, I think, and people will have different levels of capacity for it at different times. We're not I don't think empathy is limitless for any of us. It might depend on how regulated you are, whether or not you're kind of burnt out, how much you have on your plate. Maybe you are expending a lot of empathy with something that's going on in your personal life, and so that's hard to bring to work, or vice versa. I think that might resonate with lots of people for lots of different reasons, but it's especially something that is talked about a lot in healthcare and in therapy. For therapists like me, we're always thinking about, we're trained to think about self-care, about stopping ourselves from burning out, thinking about how many clients we take on at once and how many people we see in a day, because it is your empathy, your attunement is a finite resource that you have to protect. So yeah, definitely.
And when you think of all the extra labor that goes in just navigating a world that isn't kind to disabled or neurodivergent people, the capacity you have to do, or you're doing that extra work all the time, most of the time, because other people aren't meeting you with it. Are there other questions? Are there any in the back or any online? Well, actually, it's 8 o'clock. Is there a burning final question, or was there one online? I can't see if anyone from the shop was there. Yeah, go for it. A final question.
I'm sorry if it's kind of a bit jankily organised, but just about if like individualism as a kind of social organization, something that we exist in relationships of one-to-one often, and even the talk therapeutic relations, and how far that is a kind of problem unto itself. And sometimes it's more manageable to do empathy between two people, but also it maybe pressurizes in weird ways.
It was such an interesting question. I'm going to garble a version of it. But that was a question about in a really individualized world, and where a lot of this empathy happens on an individual level, even in a context that is in therapy and it's one-on-one. What do we do with that, and can it be? What was the last bit of the
Well,
question?
I'm just kind of thinking about other forms of social organization that have existed.
Okay.
And how,
If there are other better ways of doing that are better for empathy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Your question touches on this idea of individualism, and even how you mentioned in the setup of talking therapy, you know, and that one-to-one connecting and healing is it's not how it would be conceptualized of in you know, other places around the world. I will say this book is written from a fairly Western perspective, obviously, and so it really just goes into those kind of Western ideas of, you know, that we've had grown from psychology and neuroscience, and challenging why those are wrong, but also still just kind of really focusing in on that kind of one-to-one relating. But I think what you're touching on goes to a wider argument around, you know, looking at how empathy might be expressed in more collectivist cultures, or in, you know, other other ways of organizing and collecting and relating. Again, I feel like it could be a second book potentially.
Thank you. If there were any questions online, I will try and scoop them up later and ask Aimee over the signing, and then I will message you the answers. But we are out of time. We have somehow barely only scratched the surface of what this book contains. It is so full of nuance and just multitudes of it's so abundant in the way that it thinks of the world and our capacity as human beings to want to and being able to relate to each other. It is a gift. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Will you all join me in thanking Aimee for being with us today? We're going to ask you to stay seated for just a second, and we're going to extract ourselves into the front room, and then you can come up and get a book signed or ask a question. And just a reminder that we have a pay it forward system, so if you are too broke to afford a book, somebody else has put that money in the pot and you can take a book home. Please don't let that be the barrier. So yes, give us 1 second and we'll be out the front waiting for you in a minute. Okay, now be free.